And you see, that's a challenge of the Christian life, is it not? Challenge ourselves to think, now, that person who I was upset with on the phone just a little bit ago, did they see me or did they see Jesus? My wife will very quickly remind me of a moment when that was not the case. We had problems with our internet connection. Yeah, you know that frustration. And I was rather impatient with the individual on the other end of the line who was trying desperately to get our system back up because I was in the middle of a seminary exam. A seminary exam. And did he see Jesus all around me? As my wife would say, I have feet of clay, just like you do, as the saying goes. We must watch every moment and submit every moment to him, and not just in seminary exams. And it was one of my final exams for my doctorate, no less. And you just say, well, you'd have thought you'd have known by then, Brad, what this walking in the Spirit thing is all about. I do. And like you, I forget. It's a vigil every moment, every day, above and below me, before and behind me, in every eye that sees me. May Christ be all around me. Not I, but Christ. And as the baptizer said, I must decrease, and he must increase. I still have this residual cough from my cold. I'm not infectious, or I would not be here today. A new temple. We come to this portion of Yehezkel's prophecy. For I guess that's Ezekiel. And interesting what we conceive of as the temple. Well, this is a model that's in Jerusalem of the ornate temple. But as we move in for a closer look, it really is a model of Herod's temple. Very ornate, and it's been said that this was Herod the Great that refurbished Zerubbabel's temple that they built after the exile. And this was completed just a few decades before Christ walked the earth. This is the temple that was destroyed in AD 70. This is the temple that the disciples of Christ understood to be the temple around the turn of that millennium. But all Herod had done, really, most of his building, it's been said that he built it probably more as a memorial to himself as he did to Yehovah. And basically, he had redone Ezra's and Zerubbabel's temple. In Ezra 3, we see the exiles who had been repatriated attempting to worship among the rubble of the beautiful Temple of Solomon that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed 70 years earlier. And they rebuilt it, but what they rebuilt under Zerubbabel's leadership, and we read about it, Nehemiah and Ezra in that time frame, it was rather plain. It was much smaller, not ornate at all, but it was functional. But they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant, and they didn't have certain things. in the temple itself, but hey, you know what? They may do. But it was indicative of the attitude with which the Jews came back to the promised land, the ones that did. For you see, many chose to stay in the pagan land of Babylon. It was kind of a half-hearted effort to repatriate and rebuild. And the temple that Yehezkel knew was Solomon's temple. Very ornate, beautiful, and we know from the Word of God that the Spirit of God dwelt there, just like He had in the tabernacle before. Beautiful, beautiful place, a whole complex. And so as we come to this part of the study, the captives of Judah have been in Babylon for 25 years, and 14 years since that beautiful Solomon of Temple had been destroyed. And most of Yehovah's revelation to Yehezkel so far has been a short-term prophecy about His judgment and His wrath upon Israel and the nations for their many abominations. Initially, idolatry, false gods. The very first commandment was, you shall have no other gods before me. And for sacrificing their babies to those false gods. And we have seen repeatedly how that applies to where we are today. H.R. 3755, if passed, would make it legal to kill a baby from the moment of conception right up to the moment of birth. We need to repent. We need to repent. But now in this prophetic narrative, the tone of the prophecy shifts to redemption. As wicked as all that stuff was, God promised redemption through a Messiah. And the time frame shifted to long term. So, go with me, if you will, to Ezekiel chapter 40, and we begin at verse 1. In the 25th year of our captivity, Yehezkel is a careful note-taker and historian. In the beginning of the year, the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was smitten, in that same day the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither. And the words that are used here, in the beginning of the year, is actually Rosh Hashanah. And you've probably heard that term, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Oh, and you say, well, then it's probably the fall. No, it was not in the fall. Rosh Hashanah, in the beginning of the year. It's the same word that God used through the prophet Moses in Genesis 1:1. Bereshith Elohim. In the beginning, God, derivation of the same word. Rosh, Bereshith. In the beginning, Elohim, God. God's making very clear, as we'll see shortly, what this is about. In the beginning of the year. And you see, you have to understand the context. Remember, context is everything in understanding the Scriptures. Excuse me. It was not the beginning of the year as we know it, 1 January. For you see, we have a solar calendar, and we're on that third rock from the sun, right there. And our year is basically the time it takes for our Earth to orbit completely around the sun to exactly the same place. And it takes exactly 365 and a quarter days. Now, the calendar that we use, we call it the Gregorian calendar. It's basically a refinement of the Julian calendar that was developed during the time of Julius Caesar, a solar calendar. And Pope Gregory VIII in 1582 revised it to kind of tweak it so that it came around to the same thing. 365 and a quarter days, and you say, well, okay, what about that quarter? Well, we have a leap year every 4 years, and we add 1 day every 4 years. And what's funny is that people ask me all the time, well, how come Easter and Passover is early this year? Or how come it's late this year? Well, this year it's late. Well, because the Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar. The calendar they use today, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The Hebrew calendar they use is based on the time it takes for the moon, right there, to orbit around that rock that we're on, the Earth. And that takes exactly 29 and a half days for the moon to come around our Earth and come right back to the same place. New moon, as it's called. The new moon. And yes, the Hebrews have a leap year as well. But here's the difficulty. If you were to take 12 29 and a half day months, and the way they do it in the Hebrew calendar, the odd number, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 months are 30 days, and the even months, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, are 29 days. That only adds up to 354 days, which is 11 days shy of our solar calendar. So if they kept going like that, after a few years, Rosh Hashanah would be in the middle of summer, and Passover would be in the middle of winter. It'd be snowing while there's Passover. No. What they do is, every few years, they add a whole month. A whole month. And it's done 7 times in a 19-year cycle. You say, why 19 years? Well, this calendar had Babylonian and Egyptian and Greek influence. There was a Greek astronomer named Meton who devised this cycle, and it's called the Metonic cycle, whereby, with a lunar calendar, every 19 years, the new moons begin to occur on the same days. Have I lost anybody? Okay. And so, every 3rd year, the Hebrews add this additional month. And so, the Easter Passover weekend occurs on the first Sabbath after the first new moon after the vernal equinox. Well, that's what they do now. That's what they have done. You say, well, what's going to happen? You see, Rosh Hashanah this year is the 26th of September, and that is the 1st of Tishrei in their calendar. And they will begin the Jewish year 5783. You say, wow, that's a lot of years. Well, this calendar that they use was timed basically, remember, it's got Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek influence in it too. A Jewish rabbi by Maimonides in the 12th century AD, they would call it AM Anno Muni, which is Latin for in the year of the world. He devised a calculation whereby he considered creation to have occurred in the year 3760 BC. Well, by adding up the generations and so on and so forth. Okay, and we'll go with that. And so you add that since the time with the time that has happened since, and this September it will become 5783 for them, AM, Anno Muni. So, the problem is, as I said, that was adopted from Babylonian and Greek and Egyptian influence, and that is not the calendar that Ezekiel knew. This was not devised until after the exile. So, what is the biblical sacred calendar based on? The barley crop. You say the barley crop? Yeah. We're in the month of Adar right now, their 12th month. If we were to go over to Exodus chapter 9, we would see that the barley was in Abib when the 7th plague hit. You say, so what? Well, I'm getting to that. The barley crop was in Abib. That means it comes in head. It's been erroneously translated ear, as an ear of corn in some cases, but it means head. When the barley head erupts from the plant. And as you can see, it's green, you know. This is what it looks like when it's ready to harvest, 14 to 21 days after it comes into Abib. And in English, that's A-B-I-B. Abib. The barley was in Abib when the 7th plague hit and the hail hit it. If it had been harvestable, ready to harvest, they could have probably picked it up and made their flour. No, it was destroyed because there's too much moisture in it. You try grinding it, you can't make flour out of it. So the whole barley crop was lost. It says the wheat and the spelt didn't affect it because that's a later crop. But the barley was destroyed. You say, so what? Hang with me. We're getting there. The barley was in Abib. Then God said in Exodus chapter 12, Abib shall be your first month. It shall be your beginnings of months. And Exodus 12:2, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And again, Rosh is used, that word, beginning. God made very clear, the first month in your calendar is to be Abib. And it's directly related to the barley crop. Is it in Abib? Well, what happens if the barley crop is not in Abib by the time the 12th month Adar is over? That's when they add a 13th month, Adar 2, which will happen this year. We're in a Jewish leap year. So on March 4th, it will no longer be Adar 1, it will be Adar 2. During that time, the barley crop in Israel will be Abib, in the head. He was told that on the 10th day of Abib, you will select the Passover lamb. On the 14th day, you shall kill the Passover lamb, eat it, and spread the blood on your doorpost and lintel. Next chapter, 13, verse 4. Israel, in fact, left Egypt in Abib, just like God said. He reminded them of these things in Exodus 23 and then over in the 30th chapter as well. He reminded them, this is what you shall do, because it was in Abib that I brought you out of Egypt. The calendar was based on the barley crop coming into Abib, which is the first month. And so, in the Hebrew biblical sacred calendar, if the barley is not in Abib, in Israel, by the end of Adar, then, which is the 12th month, the 13th month is added, Adar 2, which will occur on March 6th, and then we have no mention of equinox. Please remember, the calendar they use today has Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek influence in it. This year, Pesach will begin at 6 p.m. on April 15th, the 14th of Abib. It was later renamed Nisan or Nisan. It's not Nissan, that's a car, but Nisan, some Jews pronounce it Nisan, some pronounce it Nisan. So now when somebody says, gee, I wonder why Easter's so late this year, you can tell them. When it's late, it's a Jewish leap year. They add a whole month, not a day. Stick with me, you'll learn some things. That's the calendar that Yehezkel knew of. And so, it was the day that they would normally select the Passover lamb. Remember, he's shifting his theme to redemption. It's very important. Very important. Because the Passover lamb was about to be selected. But they didn't have the temple. Didn't have it. Yehezkel was carried into the Spirit over to Israel, into the mountains of Israel. And he saw a man who looked like he was made of bronze. He came there, had a linen line in his hand and a measuring reed, and he stood in the gate. He saw a man, measuring rod. And just to give you a visual, he had a linen line, which is not unlike the sounding lines that the ancient navies used. They had a rock on the end of it to measure the depth of the water where they were. And it says it was 6 cubits long. You say, well, that's 18 inches, right? No, the common cubit was 18 inches. And it says that it was a cubit plus a hand width, which is 3 inches. So it was a royal cubit, which is 21 inches long. And it says it was 6 cubits long. He had a rod. This is my pool skimmer handle. It'll do. But it's perfect because I can adjust it. If you take those cubits, they're actually 21 inches. And you make 6 of those, that's 10.5 feet. So here's this bronze guy standing there with this 10.5-foot rod and a flax line. That's for measuring longer distances. You see, I could measure from here over to where Pastor Bob's sitting. But this will only do 10.5 feet. You say, what's the point, Brad? God said very clearly how long the rod was. 6 royal cubits. And then the man who was bronze told Yehezkel to remember everything that you are about to see. Well, I don't know if Yehezkel was taking notes, but he must have had a remarkable memory because he wrote it all down. And we're not going to go through each and every verse, but we are going to look for some trends here. Verse 6, beginning at the eastern gate that looks toward the east, went up the stairs thereof and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 rod broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad. And he went around measuring this whole complex with this rod. And it's not a cubit, it's a rod that measured 6 royal cubits. Wow. And as it keeps on going through the narrative, it's talking about all these measurements of all the gates and the buildings and so on and so forth. And we skip down to verse 44. And without the inner gate were the chambers for the singers, and the inner court, which is at the side of the north gate, and their respective toward the south, etc., etc. And he's measuring the whole temple, the wall, and the outer court, and the inner court. And then something very interesting is plugged right in the middle of that narrative. Skip back to verse 38. We're in Ezekiel chapter 40. And of course, if you close in closely to Ezekiel's designed temple complex, of course, it's all around the temple building right there. Verse 38, and the chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates where they washed the burnt offering. And in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that, to slay there on the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. Here are the chambers for the Levites, those that took care of the temple. Here's the altar. And what he's describing is right there inside the northern gate where the sacrifices were prepared. 4 tables were on this side, 4 tables on that, verse 41, by the side of the gate. 8 tables where they slew their sacrifices. He makes very clear sacrifices are being made. And there were hooks and a hand broad fastened around about, and upon the table was the flesh of the offering. What? So he's describing an area that is for the preparation of animal sacrifices. The burnt offering, sin offering, and trespass offerings. You say, well, okay, God was designing a temple and relaying it to Yehezkel where Jewish, Hebrew, rabbinical, Levitical worship and sacrifice would resume. If we go through chapter 41, verse after verse, this is taking a peek down into the temple itself. You can see the holy place and the Holy of Holies there with the roof removed. Look very similar to Solomon's temple, decorated with cherubim and palm trees. And so he describes the sanctuary of the most holy, and it's decorated with cherubim and palm trees. And he gives all these measurements in rods. If this were an academic class, we'd be going through each chapter verse by verse. But I wanted you to grasp the unitized message here of these 3 chapters. We go around to chapter 42. And then Yehezkel describes, this is another artist's rendering of Ezekiel's temple. Then he brought me forth to the outer court, the way toward the north. And he brought me to the chamber that was over against the separate place, which was before the building toward the north. Before the length of 100 cubits was the north door, and the breadth was 50 cubits. Over against the 20 cubits, which were the inner court, etc., etc., etc. And he measured all of these distances. Now, see, the distance between the gates, he had to use the line because that was longer than the 10.5 foot or the 6 cubit rod. He measured it, and he specifically said, Yehezkel, remember what you see and tell the exiles. He describes the chambers for the Levitical priests. Those are the 2 things on either side of the temple itself. And then he describes, toward the end of chapter 42, verse 15, now when he made an end of measuring the inner house, he brought me forth toward the gate whose prospect is toward the east, and measured it round about. And he measured the east side with the measuring rod, 500 rods. 500 rods. Now, not cubits, rods. So, and toward the end there, he measured on 4 sides, and in verse 20, he says 500 long, 500 broad. In many of the translation, they put cubits there. And the word cubit does not exist there, nor does the word rod. He measured the east side, measuring rod, 500 rods. So in other words, each wall, north, south, east, west, was 500 rods long. Let's extrapolate that. Remember, a rod was 10 and a half feet? I'll do the math for you. Times 500 is 5,250. And I remember my geography, at least some of it. And I remember 5,280 feet is a mile. So what God is showing Yehezkel, and Yehezkel is taking very close notes here, all these measurements are in there. Wow. If we had a couple hours to do this, which we don't, because I know you all want to go across the street and have cake and stuff to commemorate Pastor Bob and Anita, so I won't keep you from that. But I want you to understand something. God was very careful to give Yehezkel detailed description and measurements of this new temple. Detailed information about the reestablishment of temple worship and Levitical animal sacrifice to Yehovah. And this thing is a mile square. Just about. 30 feet shy of a mile. 500 rods by 500 rods. That's what it says. Some translations, they couldn't accept that, and so they substituted the word cubit. It's not the word cubit. The word cubit is amot. And the word rod is keneh. That's the singular. Kenim is the plural. And he said, it's 500 rods. Keneh, hamidah, shesh amot. Rods measuring 6 cubits is what he said back in chapter 40. And here, hamesh meot kanim, 500 rods. God is specific. And the translations that have cubit there in the final part of verse 20 are incorrectly translated. There is no word there, neither cubit nor rod. It just says 500. And that's based on the context previously having been stated 500 rods. And so this temple complex is a mile square. Wow. There are a number of possible interpretations of this temple. It's a magnificent thing. But I tell you, it constitutes one of the more difficult theological discussions in all of the scriptures. So, is it literal? Is it symbolic? Is it figurative, or is it future? Is it even likely? Some have even suggested, well, this is the temple that Zerubbabel should have built. And some of you are sitting there thinking, I know what he's going to say. How many of you think I know what I'm going to say? Oh, a couple brave ones. Yeah, come on, you know what I'm going to say. Or do you? Well, here's my definitive answer on that. Don't you hate when they do that? We'll take a look at that next week. Can it be determined? Well, I can tell you what we can think we determine, and we'll discuss that next week. But remember this, God gave careful measurements. I don't think God wastes his time. I don't think he wastes his prophets' lives. I think God had very specific purpose in telling Yehezkel what to write down. I do want to leave you with this concept. God has revealed these things to us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things. Yes, even the deep things of God. Amen.